The great panic over Chase Claypool lasted about 24 hours as the Bears placed him on the physically unable to perform list and then removed him from the physically unable to perform list. And hopefully throughout the process here, we learned a lesson about overreacting to small bits of Bears news in a desperate time of the offseason.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. I guess you can call it X now, or you can follow Locked On Bears at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, or do we call that Meta? And you can join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. Also, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by eBay Motors. A championship team is about each player being a perfect fit, and same thing goes for your vehicle. So for parts that fit, boy, that's hard to say. So for parts that fit, head to eBay Motors and look for the green check. Stay in the game with eBay Guaranteed Fit. eBayMotor.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. On the show today, we catch up on what's been going on with Chase Claypool and try and figure out what we know now and what we're about to get more answers from later. Actually, today as this podcast comes out, we'll hear from Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus to really get the scoop, but I have a theory on how this works, and I'm curious to see how that lines up with what the truth comes out from the head coach and GM here shortly. But then also, the Chicago Bears signed a free agent wide receiver, Isaiah Ford, formerly of the Miami Dolphins. And there have been more smoke behind potentially additional free agent signings still happening before training camp really gets rolling here. Maybe by the time you listen to this podcast, a pass rusher will have signed. But we'll look at the rumors and the options there as we get closer and closer to real padded football practices happening again. But Chase Claypool, on Sunday, placed on the physically unable to perform list. Panic ensues. Chase Claypool injured. Chase Claypool not going to be able to practice at training camp. Chase Claypool falling out of favor in Chicago. Chase Claypool going to be cut or traded. I mean, some of the discourse around this was getting nuts. I mean, ridiculous, out of control. Had not even been 24 hours. We had not known why he was on the physically unable to perform list, how long he would be on the physically unable to perform list. And as it turns out, it was about 24 hours. Chase Claypool removed on Monday from the physically unable to perform list. He will be able to perform physically at training camp. Does that mean he's going to practice right away? We'll see what we hear from Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles as the news comes out. But I have a theory about this, right? You might, because everyone wonders that, okay, why was Chase Claypool on the physically unable to perform list for 24 hours? What's the point of having put him there? And I think largely there wasn't one, but it feels to me, my guess here that we'll get the real answer to is that it was procedural in the sense that they knew that Chase Claypool had been missing practice at mini camps, was unable to perform at practice. That's what I mean by missing, not MIA, but just not able to perform. He was missing practice time because of soft tissue injuries. That was the last thing we had heard from Matt Eberflus, and that the hope was that he would be ready to go for training camp, but it was a little unclear. And we talked last week on the podcast about how important it will be for Chase Claypool to be healthy entering training camp and to stay healthy throughout training camp. For all the reasons we went through in the podcast about being able to practice and the value of being on the field for this time to really set the stage for what he's going to get and what he's going to be able to do in the regular season. And so certainly when Claypool is placed on the physically unable to perform list, it's understandable that the fear or the concern, maybe is a better word, that you start to have because of how important him being able to practice is. The flaw here is that there's no timeline on the physically unable to perform list. We don't have all that information, so we start filling in the unknown information with what tended to be closer to worst case scenarios or less good scenarios versus perhaps the real scenario where it wasn't a big deal. It was minor. And I think what happens here is that Chase Claypool was injured, and last the Bears had seen Chase Claypool, he was injured. And they know that throughout this process, throughout the time since minicamp to now, he's been trying to get healthy. He's been trying to, get right back into practice shape. But, when the general manager and the head coach first get to training camp and they're starting to get their training camp roster together, they don't know if Chase Claypool is good to go or not. So he goes on the physically unable to perform list because last we saw him, he was physically unable to perform. And then between Sunday and then now on Monday, Chase Claypool shows up to Bears training camp. Chase Claypool, I'm assuming that this is my assumption here, Chase Claypool passes a physical. Chase Claypool passes whatever threshold, whatever test. I don't know if it's truly a physical, but whatever the Bears needed to see from Chase Claypool to feel confident, whatever evaluation medically that is, for him to be able to now start practicing, that is enough to then say, all right, great, off the physically unable to perform list. Did they need to put him on it in the first place? Probably not. But I do think they maybe put it on not knowing if when he arrived at training camp, would he be good to go? Would he not? Would he be able to pass their tests, whatever evaluation, physical, whatever it might be? They probably didn't know. So you put him on a physically unable to perform list because you don't know if he's able to perform or not. And last you knew he was not. And he gets his first chance to clear it, clears it on the first go, and boom, all right, off the PUP list. And at the end of the day, no harm, no foul, right? He did not miss any time. Nothing actually happened. He was placed on a metaphorical, not even a metaphorical list, but he was placed on a list, a piece of paper filed to the league office for one day. He was on that list. 3 months from now, we're probably not going to remember that was a thing. It won't matter. It didn't matter. It shouldn't affect anything. It was just everyone clutching their pearls, getting up in arms, and getting concerned because there's a lot of people that want Chase Claypool to be successful, and there's also a lot of people that don't want Chase Claypool to be successful, and they both were concerned and had a lot to say about why he was on the physically unable to perform list. But it seems like at this point, seems to be much ado about nothing. But again, we'll get some very clear answers from, or hopefully we'll get more clarity from Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles as they give a press conference on Tuesday as this podcast is coming out. And we'll break down all the really important and relevant quotes and news and notables from that press conference on tomorrow's podcast. So make sure you come back for that. But the Bears also, perhaps contributing to this Chase Claypool concern stuff, signed a free agent wide receiver. It's like, Claypool's on PUP. Free agent wide receiver was on a workout and then signed. Could those be bad signs together? But instead, they still wanted this wide receiver separately from the Claypool moves. So we'll break down Isaiah Ford, how he might fit into this Bears depth chart and what chances he might have to make this Bears 53-man roster next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy that's affordable, easy to use, and helps make it so much more accessible to so many more people. Therapy is such an important part of my own personal mental health regimen. I do online therapy with a therapist literally once a week. Every single week I meet. It's helpful to talk through things with someone and to have that support from a medical professional standpoint. I like to think of it as like just how I go to the gym to improve my body, and I go to therapy to improve my brain. Not necessarily because something is broken, right? This is not like going to the doctor to fix something, but it's to keep improving things and to be at my best. And therapy is exactly the same way. And if you've been thinking about starting it, give BetterHelp a try because it's entirely online. It's super convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And if the therapist you get matched with isn't quite the right fit, it's really easy to switch at any time for no additional charge. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. The Chicago Bears went out and got some better help for the wide receiver position, signing free agent wide receiver Isaiah Ford. He spent the first 4 seasons of his career on the Miami Dolphins. He was a 7th-round pick by them in 2017 out of Virginia Tech, and then briefly bounced around. I think he got traded to the New England Patriots middle of a season, got cut, and then actually ended up coming back to the Miami Dolphins for one more year, and then was part of that for that final season. This last season, 2022, though, he was cut and spent the year mostly on the practice squad for the Indianapolis Colts. So not overlapping with Matt Eberflus in that regard because it was just this past season, but mostly a Miami Dolphins guy in an offensive system with Mike McDaniel that is of the same offensive skill system tree as Luke Getsy. It's not going to be a one-to-one instant pickup in comparison there, but a lot of the same types of concepts and things that you're going to ask wide receivers to do in this offense. And Ford is a guy who's got, a decent build to him. He's like 6'2", 200 pounds, and physically, like, he reminds me a little bit, and I don't want to make this a comparison as far as like who they are as players, but like Allen Robinson, only in the sense that like Ford is big, but not the biggest. He's got okay speed. He's not the fastest, but he's not slow. Kind of like Allen Robinson, Ford's got some strength, but he's not like the biggest, bulkiest wide receiver either. Like he's kind of in the middle of like good enough at all of the main physical traits. And then on top of that, he's got pretty good footwork. He's a pretty good route runner. I know in college in particular, he struggled with bad concentration drops at Virginia Tech, but over those 4 years in Miami, he was always kind of the number 4 type wide receiver in those offenses. Didn't drop passes nearly at the same rate, or at least didn't have as many of those concentration drops that really are frustrating. He generally is a guy who actually can make fairly difficult catches. Like he's got great body control where he can kind of use his body to create separation that way, at the catch point, pretty good in the contested catch situations, at least especially back in college for him. And a guy who, when your quarterback is not pinpoint accurate, he can adjust at the last minute to be able to sort of make the pass a bit more accurate. Again, like shades of like Allen Robinson, but again, I don't want you to get the impression like he's the same guy or just a weak version, but just like there's certain aspects that I get that sort of familiarity with him. The problem with Isaiah Ford coming to Chicago is right away, at best, right? The best he could hope for would be 4th on the depth chart. And sure, that would be good. That's what he's been mostly in his career with the Miami Dolphins. I think he's spot started a few times for them, but he's never had more than 200 or 300 yards in a season, a couple of touchdowns 2 years ago, but he's just not a big time contributor. And when you're not a top 3 wide receiver on your own team, typically you need to contribute on special teams in some way, right? Because DJ Moore's not going to do much special teams, or any special teams. Chase Claypool, not really going to do special teams. Darnell Mooney, unless he's a return man, not going to do much special teams. So you tend to need, for sure, your 5th and 6th wide receivers have to do special teams. And ideally, your number 4 wide receiver has to do special teams. But Isaiah Ford is now entering his 6th season in the NFL, and he has not been a special teams player. He's just not a guy who in the regular season has earned special team snaps. Over the course of his career, he's been on special teams exactly 6 times. 1 snap in 2021, 5 snaps in 2019. I think a couple of those were all as return guys. So like to me, there's a pretty significant uphill battle for him to make this Bears 53-man roster, that he would have to be so unreplaceable on offense, to be so good to be able to justify keeping him over that, over other players that would be better on special teams when you already have guys ahead of him on the depth chart that are clearly better on offense, or we're going to be a better fit there, or just going to be more talented than he is in that spot. That's what makes it tough. Because you look at, the wide receiver depth chart that he's going to be going up against in this training camp battle. You got, of course, like we talked about the big 3, right? Moore, Mooney, Claypool. Then it's the likes of Equanimeous St. Brown, who plays a lot of special teams, good, number 5, 6 type receiver. You got Dante Pettis, who's in the punt return competition. And then you got the 2 young guys, Tyler Scott and Velus Jones. And we did our wide receiver preview for training camp last week. And we kind of talked about how, like, even as much as Velus Jones struggled, he's still pretty much a 53-man roster lock, barring something outrageous. And Tyler Scott, they just drafted, so he's pretty well locked in. So those are 5 wide receivers pretty much already set. Moore, Mooney, Claypool, Scott, Jones. So now then it becomes Isaiah Ford versus Equanimeous St. Brown versus Dante Pettis versus everyone else on the roster for maybe 1 spot, maybe 2, but possibly 0. And those guys that you're going up against are all guys who contribute on special teams. I don't know, like, the likes of Scott and Jones might not be able to do enough together on special teams to be able to, like, allow for you to afford to have Isaiah Ford also not do special teams. Like, you need some of your backup wide receivers to do more special teams. And Scott will do some. Velus Jones certainly will do some. And then whoever you keep as 6 probably need to do quite a bit. And that has not been Isaiah Ford up to this point. That doesn't mean he can't do special teams at some point. It's not something that he's done a ton of. He did a little bit in the preseason, a couple of, like, early in his career, but hasn't really done much there. And to me, it feels more like an opportunity for him, to play for the Bears in the preseason, get on the field in those games, play some offensive snaps in those games to try and show 31 other teams that he's valuable enough on offense to roster even without his special teams contributions. Like that to me feels like probably the long-term path for him there. Like the path to him on the Bears 53-man roster really feels like a super, super long shot. But considering like he's played in NFL games, this is not just some camp body type guy that doesn't have any, background or any experience to rely on. Like he's done some NFL work. He has 63 catches for 681 yards in the league. That's more than a lot of the other guys on training camp rosters. So if he can make some plays in the preseason, impress another team and try and get another chance that way, or certainly a practice squad call up later on in the season, that to me feels like the whole point of for him being here. And for the Bears, you always want to see what else you got out there at wide receiver. You can never have too many weapons for your quarterback. So, why not bring in another guy that might have some tools that you like just to see where he might be able to fit and bring him back if you have an injury later in the season, and he could be a guy that was with you in training camp, so you'd trust him a little bit more than just any other old free agent right off the street later in the season. I'm guessing Isaiah Ford won't be the only brand new Chicago Bear who shows up to Halas Hall this week when the team reports to training camp. And we keep getting another, tricklings of reports and rumors and kind of somewhere in between sometimes of Bears' interest in free agents. So we'll kind of look at who they've been reportedly linked to and what other options are out there and what we're expecting this week as the Bears come back to training camp and practicing from here on out. Next on Locked On Bears. We're all still waiting for Ryan Poles to sign a veteran pass rusher off of the free agent market. We've been kind of waiting for it since free agency opened in March, and it hasn't really so of course, they signed DeMarcus Walker and Rasheem Green. I realize, yes, they have signed pass rushers since free agency opened, but really, since the NFL draft ended, we've been waiting for them to say, all right, this is still a big hole on this roster. We need to make sure we fill this entering this season because they can't get by with the current level of talent and depth at the pass rushing positions, mainly defensive end, but defensive tackle is certainly a part of that conversation there. You can always use more when it comes to proven pass rush ability. And we did get, another sort of rumor trickling from David Kaplan of ESPN Chicago, who says he's been making calls around the league, and it sounds like the Bears are still trying to pick somebody up. He said he keeps hearing that they want to add an edge rusher as soon as possible. There was also, interestingly enough, a non-edge rusher free agent report for the Chicago Bears. Jeremy Fowler of ESPN said that the Jaguars and Chicago Bears were among the teams that inquired on free agent cornerback Arthur Maulet, who had been on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think he was their slot cornerback over there. So there's some talk of maybe the Bears were interested in a cornerback there. By the end of the day, Monday, Maulet agreed to terms or was expected to sign a contract with, or I don't know exactly the wording of the reporting, is a Baltimore Raven. He's going to the Ravens, it sounds like, and so not going to be a Chicago Bear. But interesting that the team looking at a veteran slot cornerback in there as well when you've got Kyler Gordon slotting into that slot as really more of a permanent one position home for him rather than moving back and forth between the outside. You got Tyreek Stevenson on the outside, but you also have Josh Blackwell back from last season as a young but promising but still unproven backup slot cornerback option who had some nice plays here and there last season for the Bears. I do get it that the Bears don't have much in terms of experience on the bench, and a guy like Maulet has played a lot of snaps and has been around the league closer to 30. He would be the oldest player, the oldest cornerback and the most experienced cornerback on the Bears by far. Right now it's Greg Stroman and Jalen Johnson are kind of the two that carry the most experience there. So I could see some value of going out, adding a veteran at that spot. Not because you don't trust Gordon or Stevenson, and not because you want exactly because you want competition for them specifically. Sure, competition is good, and it's not because you don't trust them, but it's more hey, let's get a veteran in there that has been around the block a little bit more and can offer different perspectives and been in different systems and seen different things in different ways wide receivers are going to attack young cornerbacks in order to mentor and help these players, and also probably provide very valuable depth and be able to be somebody you trust if he had to enter the starting lineup due to injury or whatever. Trust more than a rookie Terrell Smith or a second-year undrafted free agent Josh Blackwell or Jalen Jones. You can never have too much quality veteran depth at that position as well. But really, the focus for all of us is still on pass rusher. And it still feels like, especially with the report from David Kaplan, like something's got to be coming, right? Like they know this is not great. And the theory all along has been some of these veteran pass rushers, they know they're valuable and they know what they're worth and they know they've got multiple teams interested in them. And they also know that OTAs and minicamp kind of suck. And not everybody wants to go do those if you can avoid it. So I feel that some of these veterans, they kind of know like training camp is when you show up and you got to start doing your business. But there's no rush to sign with a team when you're talented and have teams interested in with you. Like, Yannick Ngakoue isn't going to get any less money today than he would have gotten in May. And he's not going to have barely any fewer suitors as teams. You know what I mean? Like there was no real incentive for a Yannick Ngakoue or a Justin Houston or pick your veteran pass rusher of choice out there. Not a ton of incentive for them to sign with a team like the Chicago Bears earlier in the offseason. Sure, it gives you more time to get to know your teammates, get to know the defense a little bit here and there, but like you're not paying them to get to know their teammates. You know what I mean? Like you're paying them to practice, and if they don't, they don't feel like they have to, and they can't afford, they can afford to sit down, like they'll be fine. I don't think that time that they got at OTAs and minicamp would be the difference between them having a great season and not having a great season. I think some of those factors will be, largely determined training camp, preseason, and then everybody else on the roster in the regular season and beyond. But those two kind of feel like the two, right? Like either Yannick Ngakoue because he's worked with the Bears defensive line coach with the Raiders and he's a pretty consistent 10-sack type guy. But the downside there with Ngakoue is that he's never been particularly strong against the run, and the Bears tend to prefer defensive ends that are more well-rounded in that way. But he's also kind of the young guy out there at 28 years old. A lot of these other names are all 30-plus, and that's not quite the timeline the Bears tend to be on right now. The other name is Justin Houston because of some obviously real strong connections back, first of all, with Ryan Poles on the Kansas City Chiefs, but he also played a couple seasons in Indianapolis with Matt Eberflus and Alan Williams. But he's 34, and it still was a 9.5 sack guy last season, still producing at a high level, but the Bears have not been signing 30-plus-year-old players this season. I will say, we forget that it was about this time right before training camp last year that Ryan Poles signed Riley Reif and Michael Schofield, two veterans who were not part of the youth movement. They weren't 34 like Justin Houston, but they were not 25, 26, and 27 like DeMarcus Walker and Rasheem Green and a lot of the other free agents the Chicago Bears have signed. So still feels like one of them's coming, and Ryan Poles may even have something to say about that at his press conference. We'll see. It's certainly still the elephant in the room here, and I think the Bears have to address it in some way, shape, or form. And if and when they do, we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. We'll do a deep dive if the Bears do a new pass rusher here. So make sure then that you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every day. We love our everydayers that tune in 5 days a week because we are 5 days a week for you once again, all throughout the rest of the football season and in the next offseason and beyond. We are not going anywhere. I hope you don't go anywhere as well. Come back tomorrow to hear Poles and Eberflus from their press conference. And of course, you have to come back for your next opportunity to bear down.